Hi everyone. First off, I want to thank you all for being here and sharing space with me today. As a disclaimer, my PowerPoint is a little out of order, but the whole thing is about disrupting linearity, so I guess it's, but as a formal introduction, I want to introduce myself. So my name is Jo. I'm a first-year PhD student in the English department here at UCLA, where I study contemporary Asian American cultural productions that are attentive to queer diasporic sensibilities. And so my project, titled Apocalypse Now and Forever, Queer Asian Formation at the End of the World, reckons with the ongoing and ever-present catastrophes of our contemporary moment. The reality that racialized, queer, femme, migrant, and disabled populations are some of the most vulnerable within the US colonial empire. But how do we contend with these realities while envisioning a bright future for our communities? How do we make sense of our continued survival? But in thinking about survival, there is an assumption that it is in spite of something that we may not have survived. So let's turn now to 2020, where colliding tragedies caused an influx of research articles, Twitter threads, think pieces, and needless to say, poetry that painted a picture of the end of the world. There were new buzzwords, unprecedented times, the new normal, and of course, the apocalypse. And although we may understand apocalypse as an event of destruction at a cataclysmic scale, the term derives from Greek, meaning revelation, or literally to pull the lid off something. So, as we designate this era as apocalyptic, it underscores the realization writ large that we live in a violent, unsustainable world. And though this apprehension is not particularly new, especially to historically marginalized communities, I deem it necessary to investigate the works that arose within this era. And in other words, what did writers do with this revelation? And so this project really began with two poetry collections that were thematically crafted through the notion of the apocalypse. The first being Franny Choi's The World Keeps Ending and the World Goes On, and Antman Pimentel Mendoza's My Boyfriend Apocalypse. So those projects brush up against a wide scope of catastrophes, from personal losses to historical traumas, ongoing violence to future devastations. They set forth the same assertion that the world ends all the time, that the world has ended, is ending, and will continue to end. But not only were these collections published within months of each other, but both poets have also discussed writing these collections during the COVID-19 pandemic. And with that discovery, I sought to parse out the affective impact of the pandemic on queer Asian poetics. And so, during this era, temporal linearity was completely ended, and there was no assurance of futurity. And with those conditions, I thought it apt to define the pandemic within Lauren Berland's framework of the impasse, which they define as a, quote, thick moment of ongoingness that occurs after the dramatic event of a forced loss, when one no longer knows what to do or how to live, and yet must adjust, unquote. They situate this precarity within the crisis of ordinary life, figuring it as a halting or stuttering that forecloses the future. Thus, I'm interested in what we can learn from this ongoing present and how it has shifted the stakes of futurity. But in understanding this descended space, we must also witness what it generates. That is the frustration, friction, or inconvenience that emerges not only on an individual level, but within and across our communities. This is better interrogated with Berland's other notion of inconvenience, which is distinguished as a condition of, quote, navigating and generating change from within the long, broken, and fractious middle of life. In addition, I think it's crucial to note that apocalypse in literary studies isn't new. Indigenous artists have harnessed modes of survivance, queer kinship, and wonder works against ongoing dispossession long before 2020. However, COVID-19 catalyzed the ubiquity of apocalyptic themes within queer Asian art. That is to say, the pandemic initiated an uneasy proximity of Asianness and the apocalypse, re-articulating our perpetual otherness as a threat to Western civilization. With this, I believe it's generative to read Asian poetics alongside Indigenous scholars like Daniel Heath Justice. Within the colonial imaginary, indigeneity is circumscribed within the past, while Asianness is prescribed into the future. But rather than the bleakness of Asian futures, typically characterized by cultural retrograde and technical hyper-advancement, the pandemic wholly severs Asianness from futurity and entangles it within a vexed and sustained present. So we are no longer encroaching from the future. The pandemic has rendered Asianness present, inescapable, and mundane. So I argue that Asianness necessitates a sustained engagement with the present in order to reimagine Asian futurity. Thus, just as this framework of wonderworks is crucial as a site of mobilization and is defined as a term that gestures imperfectly to other ways of being in the world, it reminds us that the way things are is not how they have always been, nor is it how they must be. So while U.S. imaginaries hinge on indigenous absence and Asian bleakness, harnessing wonder can offer a strategy that challenges what justice calls the, quote, oppressive worldview that sees us as walking anachronisms, unquote. Through this, we can demand presence in order to rewrite the unraveling future. So in essence, the project investigates poetics in the face of global disasters. But more specifically, I was preoccupied with two questions, which I will try to find on you. Yes, this one, okay. So the first one comes from Lauren Berlant in Cruel Optimism, where they ask, if you live so close to death, are you alive in ways that people mean it, head capable of tilting toward an elsewhere? And Daniel Heath Justice, from Indigenous Wonderworks in the Settler Colonial Imaginary, asks, how might a different way of engaging our histories and imagining our futures chart a different course for relationship and different possibilities for the future? So I was interested in aesthetic strategies that seek to rupture paradigms of time, space, and relationality. From here, we can consider the creative generativity of the apocalypse. And for the sake of this presentation, I will focus solely on Mendoz's collection, My Boyfriend Apocalypse, and the ways it constructs alternative modes of being with and within catastrophe. And so, a short introduction to the poet and their work. Ant-Min is the author of the chapbook My Boyfriend Apocalypse. She's a full Connects writer, the interim director of the Multicultural Community Center at UC Berkeley, and an MFA student at Pacific Lutheran University. Ant-Man is based on Huichin Loanu Land, where he talks about pop music nearly all day and plays with his friends. And in terms of giving you a quick gloss of the collection, I couldn't word it better than its own blurb, so here it is. But I want to focus our attention to the last couple questions that this collection asks. These poems ask what it would be like to make out with the end of the world. Who slipped tongue first? Is the apocalypse a good kisser? Are you? So let's not turn to a poem, but instead turn to Mendoz's introduction. And there's a lot of annotations, so please ignore it. But I was very inspired when I first read through this collection. But here Mendoza asks, quote, isn't the end of the world tediously ordinary? When I say the apocalypse is ordinary, I mean that worlds end all the time. They end and still here we are, unquote. With this description, I think about Berlant's impasse and how ongoingness is not merely a product of extraordinary disasters, but rather grapples with the ordinary in the everyday catastrophes, how we cope with them and how we don't. It is a collapse of the no longer, the still here, and the not yet here. To track these temporal threads necessitates us to take seriously the inconvenient yet critical shaping and reshaping of our roots to pleasure, despair, hope, and survival. For Mendoza, because the end of the world has become utterly mundane, they seek to deploy wonder as the organizing principle for world building. So in the face of imminent disaster, she finds space for love. Or, as she puts it, quote, if I am to live through this apocalypse and the next one and the one after that, then let me take him to the page, spend some time with him, and fall in love. He offers multidimensional deconstructions of how unending violence structure our daily lives and interpersonal intimacies, cultivating possibilities of constructing webs of relation with the apocalypse itself. That is, to witness its cruelties, its inconveniences, and fall in love anyway. And in order to construct alternative modes of living within what Berlant calls the fractious middle, they require us not to inhabit or possess the infrastructures of inconvenience, but instead to, quote, desire it, to have, one might say, a crush on it, unquote. So to treat the apocalypse like a crush, to make it our boyfriends, means to embrace modes of desire outside of normative understandings of relation. When we fall in love with the broken world, we insist on its livelihood and its movability, to play with it on the path to pleasure and transformation. So from here, let's turn to Mendoza's final and titular poem, My Boyfriend Apocalypse. This poem opens up to new dimensions of pleasure and potential through her interweaving of eroticism, memory, joy, and grief. With chant-like insistence, she repeats various forms of the apocalypse. Preoccupied with temporal rupture, the poem tracks the apocalypse's occurrences, from apocalypse is not a one-time event, to apocalypse now or later, to apocalypse now and then. Apocalypse is a one-time event. Apocalypse is. Apocalypse is not an event. And finally, apocalypse now and forever. This recursive strategy produces an ever-expanding lexicon with which we play with, challenge, and survive empire. So language, in all its embodied forms, is a site where reality can be shaped and reshaped. This anaphoric chant is at once disruptive and reparative. Stretching across myriad temporal dimensions, Mendoza not only exemplifies the apocalypse's architecture of duration, but the urgency to resist it at every moment. They embrace our current world's catastrophic realities, but saturates poetics with creative and life-insistent energy in pursuit of otherwise possibilities. Or as Justice puts it, Mendoza, quote, carries a past forward to give us a future, even if it's only an imagined one, unquote. The apocalypse becomes utterly overwhelming here, expanding to subsume every facet of life, from university to work to activism to film to sex to the body, to now and then and later, and of course, forever. Despite the indexing of these tragedies, detaching from hope is not the solution. Rather, it is an understanding that our world-building project necessitates endless work and endless courage. This ongoing present unravels the potential of apocalypse to see what kinds of futures can be constructed when a world is ending. This is Wonderworks in motion. To insist on this attachment, on this desire despite despair, holds out for the life-affirming energies that this world is not solid. It is movable, it is shakeable, it can burst open to other ways of being and becoming. If we are brave enough to hope for change, we also have to risk repeating and surviving failure again and again. But with this risk, we can open up to fantasy, to speculation, to wonder. So in the face of cascading catastrophes, Mendoza explores what it means to survive and keep surviving. If we can harness the intimacies of the impasse and inconvenience, it can make the apocalypse our boyfriend. Perhaps this will be a wondrous revelation, that we can reimagine alternative routes to survival, or better yet, to a world in which queer, trans, people of color can dream, dance, riot, and live. Thank you.